What Occurred at Franklin by Ambrose Bierce. For several days, in snow and rain, General Schofield's little army had crouched in its hastily constructed defenses at Columbia, Tennessee. It had retreated in hot haste from Pulaski 30 miles to the south, arriving just in time to foil Hood, who, marching from Florence, Alabama by another road, with a force of more than double our strength, had hoped to intercept us. Had he succeeded, he would indubitably have bagged the whole bunch of us. As it was, he simply took position in front of us and gave us plenty of employment, but did not attack. He knew a trick worth two of that. Duck River was directly in our rear. I suppose both our flanks rested on it. The town was between them. One night, that of November 27, 1864, we pulled up stakes and crossed to the north bank to continue our retreat to Nashville, where Thomas and safety lay, such safety as is known in war. It was high time, too, for before noon of the next day Forrest's cavalry forded the river a few miles above us and began pushing back our own horse toward Spring Hill, 10 miles in our rear on our only road. Why our infantry was not immediately put in motion toward the threatened point, so vital to our safety, General Schofield could have told better than I. Howbeit, we lay there inactive all day. The next morning, a bright and beautiful one, the brigade of Colonel P. Sidney Post was thrown out, up the river 4 or 5 miles, to see what it could see. What it saw was Hood's head of column coming over on a pontoon bridge, and a right pretty spectacle it would have been to one whom it did not concern. It concerned us rather keenly. As a member of Colonel Post's staff, I was naturally favored with a good view of the performance. We formed in line of battle at a distance of perhaps a half mile from the bridge head, but that unending column of gray and steel gave us no more attention than if we had been a crowd of farmer folk. Why should it? It had only to face to the left to be itself a line of battle. Meantime, it had more urgent business on hand than brushing away a small brigade whose only offense was curiosity. It was making for Spring Hill with all its legs and wheels. Hour after hour we watched that unceasing flow of infantry and artillery toward the rear of our army. It was an unnerving spectacle, yet we never for a moment doubted that, acting on the intelligence supplied by our succession of couriers, our entire force was moving rapidly to the point of contact. The Battle of Spring Hill was obviously decreed. Obviously, too, our brigade of observation would be among the last to have a hand in it. The thought annoyed us, made us restless and resentful. Our mounted men rode forward and back behind the line, nervous and distressed. The men in the ranks sought relief in frequent changes of posture, in shifting their weight from one leg to the other, in needless inspection of their weapons, and in that unfailing resource of the discontented soldier, audible damning of those in the saddles of authority. But never for more than a moment at a time did anyone remove his eyes from that fascinating and portentous pageant. Toward evening we were recalled, to learn that of our 5 divisions of infantry, with their batteries, numbering 23,000 men, only one, Stanley's, 4,000 weak, had been sent to Spring Hill to meet that formidable movement of Hood's 3 veteran corps. Why Stanley was not immediately effaced is still a matter of controversy. Hood, who was early on the ground, declared that he gave the needful orders and tried vainly to enforce them. Cheatham, in command of his leading corps, that he did not. Doubtless the dispute is still being carried on between these chieftains from their beds of asphodel and Mullion Elysium. So much is certain. Stanley drove away Forrest and successfully held the junction of the roads against Cleburne's Gowns, the only infantry that attacked him. That night the entire Confederate army lay within a half mile of our road, while we all sneaked by, infantry, artillery, and trains. The enemy's camp fires shone redly, miles of them, seemingly only a stone's throw from our hurrying column. His men were plainly visible about them, cooking their suppers, a sight so incredible that many of our own, thinking them friends, strayed over to them and did not return. At intervals of a few hundred yards we passed dim figures on horseback by the roadside, enjoining silence. Needless precaution. We could not have spoken if we had tried, for our hearts were in our throats. But fools are God's peculiar care. Arid one of his protective methods is the stupidity of other fools. By daybreak our last man and last wagon had passed the fateful spot unchallenged, and our first were entering Franklin, 10 miles away. Despite spirited cavalry attacks on trains and rear guard, all were in Franklin by noon, and such of the men as could be kept awake were throwing up a slight line of defense, enclosing the town. Franklin lies, or at that time did lie, I know not what exploration might now disclose, on the south bank of a small river, the Harpeth by name. For 2 miles southward was a nearly flat, open plain, extending to a range of low hills through which passed the turnpike by which we had come. From some bluffs on the precipitous north bank of the river was a commanding overlook of all this open ground, which, although more than a mile away, seemed almost at one's feet. On this elevated ground the wagon train had been parked and General Schofield had stationed himself, the former for security, the latter for outlook. Both were guarded by General Wood's infantry division, of which my brigade was a part. "We are in beautiful luck," said a member of the division staff. With some prevision of what was to come and a lively recollection of the nervous strain of helpless observation, I did not think it luck. In the activity of battle one does not feel one's hair going gray with vicissitudes of emotion. For some reason to the writer unknown, General Schofield had brought along with him General D.S. Stanley, who commanded two of his divisions, ours and another, which was not in luck. In the ensuing battle, when this excellent officer could stand the strain no longer, he bolted across the bridge like a shot and found relief in the hell below, where he was promptly tumbled out of the saddle by a bullet. Our line, with its reserve brigades, was about 1.5 miles long, both flanks on the river, above and below the town, a mere bridge head. It did not look a very formidable obstacle to the march of an army of more than 40,000 men. In a more tranquil temper than his failure at Spring Hill had put him into, Hood would probably have passed around our left and turned us out with ease, which would justly have entitled him to the Humane Society's great gold medal. Apparently that was not his day for saving life. About the middle of the afternoon, our field glasses picked up the Confederate head of column emerging from the range of hills previously mentioned, where it is cut by the Columbia Road. But, ominous circumstance, it did not come on. It turned to its left, at a right angle, moving along the base of the hills, parallel to our line. Other heads of column came through other gaps and over the crests farther along, impudently deploying on the level ground with a spectacular display of flags and glitter of arms. I do not remember that they were molested, even by the guns of General Wagner, who had been foolishly posted with 2 small brigades across the turnpike, a half-mile in our front, where he was needless for apprisal and powerless for resistance. My recollection is that our fellows down there in their shallow trenches noted these portentous dispositions without the least manifestation of incivility. As a matter of fact, many of them were permitted by their compassionate officers to sleep, and truly it was good weather for that. Sleep was in the very atmosphere. The sun burned crimson in a gray-blue sky through a delicate Indian summer haze, as beautiful as a daydream in paradise. If one had been given to moralizing, one might have found material aplenty for homilies in the contrast between that peaceful autumn afternoon and the bloody business that it had in hand. If any good chaplain failed to improve the occasion, let us hope that he lived to lament in sackcloth of gold and ashes of roses his intellectual unthrift. The putting of that army into battle shape, its change from columns into lines, could not have occupied more than an hour or two, yet it seemed an eternity. Its leisurely evolutions were irritating, but at last it moved forward with atoning rapidity, and the fight was on. First, the storm struck Wagner's isolated brigades, which, vanishing in fire and smoke, instantly reappeared as a confused mass of fugitives inextricably intermingled with their pursuers. They had not stayed the advance a moment, and as might have been foreseen were now a peril to the main line, which could protect itself only by the slaughter of its friends. To the right and left, however, our guns got into play, and simultaneously a furious infantry fire broke out along the entire front, the paralyzed center excepted. But nothing could stay those gallant rebels from a hand-to-hand encounter with bayonet and butt, and it was accorded to them with hearty goodwill. Meantime, Wagner's conquerors were pouring across the breastwork like water over a dam. The guns that had spared the fugitives had now no time to fire. Their infantry supports gave way, and for a space of more than 200 yards in the very center of our line, the assailants, mad with exultation, had everything their own way. From the right and the left their gray masses converged into the gap, pushed through, and then spreading, turned our men out of the works so hardly held against the attack in their front. From our viewpoint on the bluff we could mark the constant widening of the gap, the steady encroachment of that blazing and smoking mass against its disordered opposition. "It is all up with us," said Captain Dawson, of Woodstaff. "I am going to have a quiet smoke." I do not doubt that he supposed himself to have borne the heat and burden of the strife. In the midst of his preparations for a smoke, he paused and looked again. A new tumult of musketry had broken loose. Colonel Emerson Optica had rushed his reserve brigade into the melee and was bitterly disputing the Confederate advantage. Other fresh regiments joined in the countercharge. Commanderless groups of retreating men returned to their work, and there ensued a hand-to-hand contest of incredible fury. 2 long, irregular, mutable, and tumultuous blurs of color were consuming each other's edge along the line of contact. Such devil's work does not last long, and we had the great joy to see it ending, not as it began, but more nearly to the heart's desire. Slowly the mobile blur moved away from the town, and presently the gray half of it dissolved into its elemental units, all in slow recession. The retaken guns in the embrasures pushed up towering clouds of white smoke. To east and to west along the reoccupied parapet ran a line of misty red till the Spitfire crest was without a break from flank to flank. Probably there was some Yankee cheering, as doubtless there had been the rebel yell, but my memory recalls neither. There are many battles in a war, and many incidents in a battle. One does not recollect everything. Possibly I have not a retentive ear. While this lively work had been doing in the center, there had been no lack of diligence elsewhere, and now all were as busy as bees. I have read of many successive attacks, charge after charge, but I think the only assaults after the first were those of the second Confederate lines, and possibly some of the reserves. Certainly there were no visible abatement and renewal of effort anywhere, except where the men who had been pushed out of the works backward tried to re-enter, and all the time there was fighting. After resetting their line, the victors could not clear their front, for the baffled assailants would not desist. All over the open country in their rear, clear back to the base of the hills, drifted the wreck of battle, the wounded that were able to walk, and through the receding throng pushed forward, here and there, horsemen with orders and footmen whom we knew to be bearing ammunition. There were no wagons, no caissons the enemy was not using, and could not use his artillery. Along the line of fire we could see, dimly in the smoke, mounted officers, singly and in small groups, attempting to force their horses across the slight parapet, but all went down. Of this devoted band was the gallant General Adams, whose body was found upon the slope, and whose animal's forefeet were actually inside the crest. General Claiborne lay a few paces farther out, and 5 or 6 other general officers sprawled elsewhere. It was a great day for Confederates in the line of promotion. For many minutes at a time broad spaces of battle were veiled in smoke. Of what might be occurring there conjecture gave a terrifying report. In a visible peril observation is a kind of defense. Against the unseen we lift a trembling hand. Always from these regions of obscurity we expected the worst, but always the lifted cloud revealed an unaltered situation. The assailants began to give way. There was no general retreat. At many points the fight continued, with lessening ferocity and lengthening range, well into the night. It became an affair of twinkling musketry and broad flares of artillery. Then it sank to silence in the dark. Under orders to continue his retreat, Schofield could now do so unmolested. Hood had suffered so terrible a loss in life and morale that he was in no condition for effective pursuit. As at Spring Hill, daybreak found us on the road with all our impedimenta except some of our wounded, and that night we encamped under the protecting guns of Thomas, at Nashville. Our gallant enemy audaciously followed, and fortified himself within rifle reach, where he remained for 2 weeks without firing a gun and was then destroyed.